Mark, there you are.
So,
Hello, good to see you.
I'm here.
Good, great. Okay. And Mark, do you have a PowerPoint that you need to share?
I do. I will attempt to share it here.
Great. If you want to, yeah, it looks like your screen's coming up. I will introduce you as you do that. So we shift from catastrophe and detection to sports and Imperial Gothic in this panel, maintaining the strong Canadian contingent for the panel, the conference, which I'm very pleased to see. Our first speaker is Mark Alberstadt. I don't know why that was so difficult for me there. Who is a Sherlockian Doylean living in Nova Scotia in Canada. We've got both coasts represented at this conference. He is the co-editor, along with his wife Joanne, of Canadian Homes, which is a quarterly journal of the bookmakers of Toronto. He's written many articles on Conan Doyle and sport, and has also spoken about the topic at meetings and podcasts, and is the founder of the Spence Monroes, the only Sherlockian group in Atlantic Canada. And your PowerPoint has just come up, so that's perfect.
Yeah, I'm having some PowerPoint problems here. I will try to restart it.
Sure. We did see it briefly there.
Okay.
But it's just it's now your general screen.
Right.
There it is.
Okay. Let's see if you can see the main one. Okay. Is that the?
Oh, it's back to the
Uh,
other the program now. So I wonder.
okay. How to switch? Okay. Let's see.
If you maybe close the program on your screen and just have your PowerPoint up and then share it from there.
Yeah, let's try that. And presentation view. And let's try there.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Well, I'm going to be speaking on Conan Doyle's sport and national identity. First, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. It's such an international conference. Hello from snowy and cold Nova Scotia. As many of the speakers and attendees know, Conan Doyle was an avid sportsman. This looped slideshow that I'm now showing demonstrates just a bit of Conan Doyle's love of sport, be it boxing, baseball, cycling, cricket, rugby, and a list of sports that goes on. And he was always willing to try his hand at anything, and he often excelled at it when he did. Whether he was a natural athlete or just an avid sportsman could be debated. When I interviewed Dame Jean Conan Doyle in 1997, she wanted her father to be remembered as a good all-rounder when it came to sports, and as the slideshow demonstrates, he certainly was. What Doyleans have to realize is that his love of sport and top-notch athletes got baked into his writing at many levels, and that love of sports was linked with his views of the British people and empire. We'll see through some examples that I'll bring up that Conan Doyle saw athletes in every hedgerow. Sometimes, as when he gave a speech, this notion of sports and nationalism wasn't far from the surface. In late October 1899, at the Victoria Park Cricket Association at the Champion Hotel, Aldersgate Street, London, Conan Doyle gave a speech and presented the Challenge Cups and medals for that season. The speech, which was given at the start of the Boer War, was reported on by a handful of newspapers and said in part, so this is Conan Doyle speaking, I'll try not to give any kind of accent or anything. At a time of national excitement like the present, what a grand thing it was for England that her sons possessed the love of manly games that ran in their veins. People talked of calling out the reserves. Why? They had not begun to touch the reserves. The reserves of this country were the cricketers, the footballers, and the hunting men. If ever England got in a hole, it was the sporting men and the sporting spirit that would pull her out of it. The whole justification for cricket was the manliness it produced. And as long as there was a chance of war, Englishmen must keep themselves manly and warlike. From this glimpse into Conan Doyle's thoughts on sportsmen, and in particular cricketers, for him, it is the sportsmen of England that really make up the protectors of the country. It is the sportsmen who, when the regular forces are strained, can step up and protect their country with the manliness and warlike nature gained from the cricket pitch. For Conan Doyle, manliness, sport, and national security are all seen together, like the halves of a cricket ball. Keep in mind, this is the same year he wrote to his mother saying he alone, quote, had perhaps the strongest influence over young men, especially young athletic sporting men, of anyone in England, bar Kipling, end quote. Today, there is still cricket played at Victoria Park in East London. There are 3 cricket pitches and a Victoria Park Community Cricket League. Image-wise, we have 2 newspaper clippings reporting on Conan Doyle's speech and an ad for the Champion Hotel, which was demolished sometime around 1901, although it was built in 1825. So now on to a few characters. At the beginning of part 2 of the 1899 story, The Croxley Master, a story infused with the history of boxing, Doyle wrote of the working men who were about to attend the boxing match, quote, warped with labor and twisted by toil, bent double by week-long work in the cramped coal galleries, these men still gilded their harsh and hopeless lives by their devotion to sport. It was their one relief, the only thing which could distract their mind from sordid surroundings and give them an interest beyond the blackened circle which enclosed them. Literature, art, science, all these things were beyond their horizon. But the race, the football match, the cricket, the fight, these were things which they could understand. Sometimes brutal, sometimes grotesque, the love of sport is still one of the great agencies which make for the happiness of our people. Every one of these runneled workers, slouching with his dog at his heels, to see something of the fight was a true unit of his race. End quote from the Croxley Master. Bypassing Conan Doyle's thoughts on the British population being a race of people, this paragraph really tells us all we need to know about Conan Doyle's sport and national identity, at least as far as those enjoying the sport from the sidelines for Conan Doyle. He sees the mass of the British population, albeit men, as lovers of sport, a topic they understand, gravitate to, and can rally behind. The expansiveness of the statement not only shows Conan Doyle's view of the sporting public as a homogeneous whole, but also, in this instance, they all seem to be from one strata of society, i.e. the working class. It is, of course, many of these men who would go on to fight the Boers and later fight and die on the battlefields of Europe in World War I. He knows these are not the people reading Henry James and George Gissing. They are reading the sporting pages of the halfpenny paper. So we're going to talk about The Lost World, which has already been discussed a few times today. With these thoughts on Conan Doyle's views on the sporting public and the sportsmen of England in mind, let's look at a few of the characters. Although Conan Doyle did write about some royalty, the Crown Prince of in the Scandal in Bohemia springs to mind, let's start with Lord John Roxton from The Lost World. When the book describes Lord John, he says, Lord John Roxton's reputation as a sportsman and traveler is, of course, world famous, said the chairman. At the same time, it would certainly be well to have a member of the press upon such an expedition. Another quote when describing Roxton says, but amid these varied ornaments, there were scattered trophies which brought back strongly to my recollection the fact that Lord John Roxton was one of the great all-round sportsmen and athletes of his day. A dark blue oar crossed with a cherry pink one above his mantelpiece spoke of the old Oxonian and Leander man, while the foils and boxing gloves above and below them were the tools of a man who had won supremacy with each. Then he goes on to describe Roxton. In figure, he was spare but strongly built. Indeed, he had often proved that there were few men in England capable of such sustained exertions. His height was a little over 6 feet, but he seemed shorter on account of peculiar rounding of the shoulders. End quote. Despite that last little bit of the description, we could be describing Sherlock Holmes as being over 6 feet and able to quite the exertion. From these descriptions of Roxton, we see that Conan Doyle was building not only a strong character physically, but also one we could remember and trace through the story, and we could rely on him and his sporting strength and ability through the story. He isn't just somebody off the street. He's a lord, and he's one of the best all-round sportsmen England has ever produced, according to Conan Doyle. Conan Doyle pairs him with Edward Malone, another person who's been mentioned already. When it comes to Malone, one of the introductions goes as follows. By the way, are you by any chance Malone who is expected to get his rugby cap for Ireland? A reserve, perhaps. I thought I remembered your face. Why, I was there when you got that try against Richmond. As fine a swerving run as I saw the whole season. I never miss a rugby match if I can help it, for it is the manliest of games we have left. Well, I did ask you here just to talk about sports. We've got business to fix. However, you do get the feeling these two could go on and talk about sports for hours and hours, and it would be interesting for some of us to listen to what he had to say. When Conan Doyle was plotting The Lost World and assembling the team which would go to the mysterious plateau, he naturally had Challenger and the skeptic Summerlee. He then added two more, both, curiously, with strong sporting backgrounds. Creating a sporting background for Lord Roxton is an interesting choice. He brings with him far more than title and money. He was one of England's finest athletes, as we have said. And Malone was obviously a national class rugby player. Why did Conan Doyle add these attributes? It is clearly not making either man a kind of British everyman. We have the nobility of Roxton and the working class Malone, but we also have the cream of British sportsmanship, which Conan Doyle adds in. Continuing on the theme of the best and brightest in Conan Doyle's eyes are athletes and sportsmen, let's look at a brief passage from The Latin Tutor, first published in Strand magazine in April 1899. The story was retitled The Usher of Lea House in the collected volumes Round the Fire Stories. So there's a little passage in this story. Your name, sir, said he, sitting pen in hand, red-lined folio in front of him. Harold Weld. Oxford or Cambridge? Cambridge. Honors? No, sir. Athlete? Nothing remarkable, I'm afraid. Not a blue? Oh, no. Mr. Lumsden shook his head despondently and shrugged his shoulders in a way which sent my hopes down to zero. There is very keen competition for masterships, Mr. Weld, said he. The vacancies are few and the applicants innumerable. A first-class athlete or a cricketer or a man who passed very highly in his examinations can usually find a vacancy. I might always say in the case of a cricketer. But the average man, if you will excuse the description, Mr. Weld, has a very great difficulty, almost an insurmountable difficulty, end quote. From this brief interview, we can see that Conan Doyle, when looking at applicants for a mastership, sets the first-class athlete above everyone else. He may not have been the greatest Latin scholar, but if he was a first-class athlete, this guy was going to get the job. And especially if it was in Conan Doyle's favorite sport, cricket. Fear not, this tutor does find a position in a small school, despite not being a remarkable athlete. Once again, we see Conan Doyle separating out the everyman from the athlete. The athlete is the best, the brightest, and the first among equals to get the position, the job, and the accolades. I think I'll close this short romp through ACD land with something from the Sherlock Holmes canon, since that is what brought me and most others to Conan Doyle first. I'm not, however, going to bring in an example from the obvious sporting stories, such as The Missing Three Quarters. This example is from the home spy story of His Last Bow, and there's a part of the manuscript there. When a superior officer was describing von Bork, the German spy, he said, "You yacht against them, you hunt with them, you play polo, you match them in every game. Your four-in-hand takes a prize at Olympia. I have even heard that you go the length of boxing with the young officers. What is the result? Nobody takes you seriously. You are a good old sport. Quite a decent fellow for a German. A hard-drinking, nightclub, knockabout town, devil-may-care young fellow. And all the time, this quiet country house of yours is the center of half of the mischief in England, and the sporting squire, the most astute Secret Service man in Europe. Genius, my dear von Bork, genius." Later, once Holmes has von Bork, he says, "But you have one quality which is very rare in a German, Mr. von Bork. You are a sportsman, and you will bear me no ill will when you realize you, who have outwitted so many other people, have at last been outwitted yourself." So here we see, in the end, the German all-round sportsman being defeated by the Ubermensch Sherlock Holmes, who didn't even know who Godfrey Staunton was in The Adventure of the Missing Three-Quarter. The story was published in September 1917, just a few years after Conan Doyle's difficult time trying to create a strong infrastructure for the British Olympic team for the future 1916 Olympics, which never happened. He was on the British organizing committee after the disastrous 1912 games in Stockholm, where England placed third and Germany not far behind in sixth place. There can be little doubt that these examples that I've just given, and many more lurking in the worlds Conan Doyle created, that he saw national class athletes as not only the first among equals, but well ahead of most of the British population in nationalism and defense of the realm. To Conan Doyle, they represent the best of the British, and the best on the cricket pitch, the squared ring, and almost any other sporting venue. Conan Doyle's stories are littered with exceptional national class athletes. Why are there so many fine athletes? Could be a question I could pose for another talk, but suffice to say, when it is recommended that you write what you know, Conan Doyle did just that, as he did know many athletes, and of course was one himself, as that opening slideshow demonstrated. When you or I walk through life, we may know or meet someone at this level of sport. We might meet an Olympian. We might be neighbors with a national class athlete. Percentage-wise, it's just bound to happen to some of us. For Conan Doyle, they are part of everyday life. All the stories have some aspect of his sporting life, or at least part of his very vivid imagination. Thank you for your time.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Mark. That was great. So we're going to move now from this. Oh, yes, Douglas. Douglas, do you have a PowerPoint?
I'm just looking for it.
Okay, great. I'll introduce you as you bring that up. From yes, it's there. Yeah. Excellent.
Brilliant. Okay.
Great. Okay,
Good.
let me introduce you.
Yes.
Douglas Kerr is a former professor of English and Dean of Arts at Hong Kong University and honorary research fellow at Birkbeck in London. He's the author of Wilfred Owen's Voices, Eastern Figures, Conan Doyle, Writing Profession and Practice, and Oriental Orwell. Those are his 4 books, but he's published many more articles and chapters beyond that. He is also our fearless leader on the Edinburgh edition of the works of Arthur Conan Doyle. His first edition, Memories and Adventures, Douglas has edited, and that has just come out. So we'll be looking forward to reading or seeing our hard copies of that soon. I will hand over to him for genre games, Conan Doyle and the Imperial Gothic.
Thanks very much, Christine. So Imperial Gothic is a term invented by Patrick Brantlinger in his book Rule of Darkness, an important study of British literature and imperialism. Brantlinger describes Imperial Gothic as a genre, quote, that blend of adventure story with Gothic elements, unquote. The genre flourished in the exuberant and varied late Victorian print culture that served a greatly expanded reading public, and especially in that culture's literary flagship, the short story. So my field of inquiry today has the axes of two late 19th century cultural technologies, the genre of Imperial Gothic and the literary form of the short story. Late Victorian and Edwardian readers, with their insatiable demand for imaginative writing served up in periodicals, were offered a rich diet of genre fiction. Genres included things like espionage stories, detective stories, tales of school life or imperial adventure, science fiction, ghost stories, westerns, and so on, and many sort of smaller divisions of genre. At this time, periodicals, authors, and their agents developed what we could call a genre literacy, what I call a genre literacy, and so did their readers. As Tsvetan Todorov puts it, genres function as horizons of expectation for readers and as models of writing for authors. And, says Todorov, readers read in function of the generic system, even if they're not conscious of the system. Besides confining my attention to short fiction, I'm going to modify Brantlinger's description of Imperial Gothic in three ways, briefly. First, I'll confine it to fiction that has a supernatural element. Not all Gothic fiction does. Importantly and scandalously, the presence of the supernatural in fiction is a challenge or affront to realism. And realism had been the dominant mode of English bourgeois fiction in the 19th century. Even so, a history of the 19th century novel could be written, and I'd like to do it someday, in terms of a struggle between realism and elements of the supernatural. The second modification of Brantlinger is of a different kind. Brantlinger sees Imperial Gothic as inevitably deconstructive of the imperialism that gives it expression. I will suggest that Imperial Gothic can be not only a vehicle, but also a management of imperial anxiety. And thirdly, Brantlinger doesn't consider that if Imperial Gothic is a genre, other genres can be brought to bear to counter it in a sort of war or game of genres, hence my title, genre games. But particularly in prose fiction, which Bakhtin saw as essentially dialogical in nature, work in a single genre is a rarity. More often, genres are in internal dialogical contention. Conan Doyle, praised by a recent critic as the greatest genre writer Britain has ever produced, was a master at these genre games. Now I'm going to take two Conan Doyle tales to illustrate my theme. Originally, it was three, but I've ditched lot number 249, The Mummy Story, for reasons of space. Both were collected in Round the Fire Stories, 1908, though The Brown Hand had appeared in The Strand in 1899, and The Fiend of the Cooperage, my second story, had had three periodical publications in 1897 and 98. Conan Doyle liked to collect his tales according to genre, as we all know. The tales in Round the Fire Stories were, he says in the preface, concerned with the grotesque and with the terrible, such tales as might well be read round the fire upon a winter's night. The presence in several of these tales of elements of horror and the supernatural in an imperial context entails the main feature of Imperial Gothic, which is its challenge to realism and what might be called the ideology of common sense that expresses itself in realism. One of these tales is The Brown Hand. It is in the established genre of the ghost story. The story concerns the visit of young Dr. Hardacre to his rich uncle, the retired Indian surgeon Sir Dominic Holden, in his house in Wiltshire. Signs of the Gothic are planted early. The landscape is uncanny, actually in a Freudian sense, as, quote, this is Hardacre narrating, I was impressed by the weird nature of the scenery. The few scattered cottages of the peasants were so dwarfed by the huge evidences of prehistoric life that the present appeared to be a dream and the past to be the obtrusive and masterful reality. This is quite close to the landscape of Hound of the Baskervilles, which is Gothic. Hardacre approaches the manor house, quote, two broken and weather-stained pillars, each surmounted by a mutilated heraldic emblem, flanked the entrance to a neglected drive, mutilated, of course, and so on. Now, this is Gothic language. Descriptions of this kind earned the disapproval of David Punter, who notes their thoroughly derivative Gothic furniture borrowed from Wilkie Collins, Le Fanu, and others. And Punter complains, quote, Conan Doyle delves into the corpus of available myths and themes, Gothic myths and themes, without adding anything to them, unquote. But I think this is unfair. It doesn't allow for the possibility that Conan Doyle is deliberately deploying these properties as cues or stimuli for a certain response. His readers' genre literacy will show them that everything in the story's setup shouts Gothic. He needs to establish the Gothic paradigm in order later to subvert or disappoint it. Sir Dominic, too, when he appears, the uncle, is outlandish and Gothic in appearance, first seen cowering over the fire, quote, the red glow of the embers beating upon a huge craggy face, unquote. Young Hardacre, a medical man, diagnoses the case. He says, quote, I believed that he was stricken with some mortal ailment, that he knew himself to be exposed to sudden death, that he lived in terror of it, a Gothic cliche. He is literally a haunted man. But as luck would have it, his young nephew is a member of the Society for Psychical Research and is happy to sit up in the proper SPR manner to view the apparition, so he stays awake to meet the ghost. Far from alarming, Hardacre finds this experience agreeable. The ghost is that of a Pushtu tribesman whose hand Sir Dominic, the surgeon, surgically amputated 10 years before. Hardacre understands that the haunting might be stopped if the ghost, who believes the body must be whole if it is to make a perfect dwelling for the spirit after death, is reunited with his hand, or, the original having been lost in a fire, with a hand. So, though the ghost is actual, it holds no terrors for the young psychic researcher. He says, I have no pretense to greater physical courage than my neighbors, but familiarity with the subject robs it of those vague and undefined terrors which are the most appalling to the imaginative mind. In the atmosphere of this brisk, no-nonsense modernity, the tale becomes a light comedy. The shadows of the Gothic, carefully assembled early in the story, are dispelled. Hardacre goes to London and procures from a doctor friend who works at the Shadwell Seamen's Hospital the brown hand recently amputated from a Lascar, Asian seaman. But this hand is rejected by the ghost because, as it turns out, it is a left hand, and the one he lost was the right. So there's an element of farce to this. A second and correct hand is acquired, ready for the ghost on his next manifestation. Holden reports the last return, sorry, that's Holden, I should have showed you that before, the last return of the apparition to his bedroom. And Holden says, he was smiling. I saw the gleam of his white teeth through the dim light. He stood facing me at the end of my bed, and 3 times he made the low Eastern salam, which is their solemn leave-taking. And the 3rd time that he bowed, he raised his arms over his head, and I saw his 2 hands outstretched in the air. So he vanished, and I believe forever. The Gothic has been defanged, and the Oriental, the figure of the Oriental, no longer a figure of terror, has become a quaint good native. I put that in inverted commas, a good native, a person, familiar figure in imperial literature, a person of funny but ultimately harmless superstitions and good manners. To complete the containment of the element of Imperial Gothic, Conan Doyle has already wrapped it up, sandwiched it in another genre, perhaps the most dominant genre of the 19th century bourgeois novel, the story of family relations, property and inheritance, and the young person making their way in the world, the story of many of the great 19th century novels. The opening and closing paragraphs of The Brown Hand put this framing tale in the foreground. The opening words of the story are, quote, everyone knows that Sir Dominic Holden, the famous Indian surgeon, made me his heir, unquote. What follows then is to show how Hardacre found favor with the old man. And the last paragraph of the story recounts how, upon inheriting, he has become the head of an important Wiltshire family. Quote, I at least have reason to bless the memory of the man with the brown hand. Hardacre concludes, for the ghost has been instrumental in the rise to material fortune of a young doctor on the make. It is an old story, that is to say, it's a familiar fictional genre, comically deployed to envelop and defeat the story of the Dark Orient. My second example is the story The Fiend of the Cooperage, a story set on the Fever Coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa, which Conan Doyle had visited on the cargo steamer Mayumba in 1881. The story first published in the same year, this is for Robert Hampson, first published in the same year, 1897, as Conrad's stories, The Lagoon and An Outpost of Progress. In fact, that illustration could almost be an illustration of An Outpost of Progress, except it has the wrong flag. In An Outpost of Progress, it would be the Belgian flag, but it's also set by the side of in a trading post by the side of a great African river. The Fiend of the Cooperage has a Conradian beginning, with the narrator Meldrum, a butterfly collector, bringing his yacht in to anchor by an island at the mouth of the great Oguwai River on the west coast of Africa, where he's greeted, as you can see, by two Englishmen who are called Walker and Dr. Severall, who run the trading station. Who run the trading station. Meldrum immediately recognizes the type, having met them for the first time. He says, quote, "Everywhere from Sierra Leone downwards, I had found the same reeking swamps, the same isolated fever-racked communities, and the same bad jokes. There is something approaching to the divine in that power of man to rise above his conditions and to use his mind for the purpose of mocking at the miseries of his body." So he speaks of these men in their outposts of progress with admiration for their stoicism in difficult conditions. The genre here, I would argue, is not just the popular tale of imperial frontiers, but a particular subdivision of that tale, specifically a Blackwoods type imperial tale, conforming to that magazine's presentation of empire as described in a very good article by David Finkelstein. David Finkelstein says that in Blackwood's magazine, empire is inevitably seen as part of a disordered universe, commented on and where feasible acted upon by earnest British colonialists bringing their skills, technology and moral superiority to the task of ruling, quote, inferior races. Blackwood's magazine, known to its authors as MAGA, was the house journal of the empire. Quote, I love this sentence, "There isn't a single club and mess room and man of war in the British seas and dominions," wrote Joseph Conrad with satisfaction, which hasn't its copy of MAGA. And MAGA, of course, published Heart of Darkness and Lord Jim. So this is a Blackwoods type imperial outpost story. But this is an outpost in Fiend of the Cooperage. This is an outpost of progress and a liminal space in more ways than one. Quote, "We are living here just upon the edge of the great unknown," the doctor tells Meldrum. And he goes on, "Every log which is carried past us by the current of the river has come from an undiscovered country." Now, the wording here is interesting. These portentous verbal signals or cues of the supernatural, the great unknown, the undiscovered country, are borne out in the story when Meldrum learns that the local workers have become too terrified to sleep on the island. Near to the European's house is a cooperage, which is a place where barrels are made by coopers. Near to the European's house is a cooperage where barrels for palm oil are made. And palm oil is the principal trade good. A cooperage where barrels for palm oil are made. And in the past 6 days, he learns 2 night watchmen have disappeared without trace. And according to the doctor, the locals, he doesn't use that word, he uses a different word. The locals swear that there is a fiend in the cooperage who claims a man every 3rd night. So there's the Gothic setup. Meldrum, no doubt a reader of the Sherlock Holmes stories, reacts predictably. Meldrum's immediate reaction is to ask, "Have you no clue?" I asked. "Was there no mark of violence, no blood stain, no footprints? nothing to give a hint as to what kind of danger you may have to meet. So, in other words, Meldrum is trying to, in these genre games, Meldrum is trying to turn the Gothic story into a detective story, which would be more easy to manage, where problems could be solved. But no, in this case, the protocols of detection are no remedy. No clues have been left, and Meldrum's attempt to shift the story into a more reassuring genre fails. Next, while Walker succumbs to fever and has to stay in the house, Meldrum agrees to accompany Dr. Severall and spend a night sitting up in the cooperage. This is another version of the generic SPR Ghost Watch. It is, of course, a dark and stormy night, and the watchers are armed. They pass an uncomfortable and nervous vigil. Quote, "No force on earth would have kept me here without a comrade," thinks Meldrum. But with the dawn, they leave the ill-omened cooperage and go up to the house. Just when the danger seems past, a shock awaits them. Classic Gothic trope. Just when the danger seems past, a shock awaits them. They discover that Walker is lying dead in his bed, all his bones broken, his body absolutely soft and limp. Of his killer, there is no sign. Although Walker had earlier told his steward that, quote, "white men don't run away from the post where they are placed," Walker's chiding the servants for not wanting to stay on the island overnight. White men don't run away from the post where they are placed. Even so, the two surviving Europeans, Severall and Meldrum, now follow their servants' example and panic, beating a retreat to Meldrum's yacht offshore. Quote, "If we did not run, it was because each of us wished to keep up the last shadow of his self-respect before the other." The invasion of the inexplicable and supernatural threatens to overwhelm the Blackwoods type story of imperial stoicism, as Severall seems to confess, and he says, "I've heard of voodoo devilry, and I've laughed at it with the others, but that poor old Walker, a decent, God-fearing, 19th century Primrose League Englishman, should go under like this without a whole bone in his body, it's given me a shake. I won't deny it." So, can the situation and the tale be rescued from its terrifying Gothic fiend? Yes. Conan Doyle now produces a coup de théâtre. A crewman on the yacht has seen something, and I'm going to read this fast. I ought to read it slowly. They're on the yacht, anchored in the river. A huge black tree trunk was coming down the river, its broad glistening back just lapped by the water. And in front of it, about 3 feet in front, arching upwards like the figurehead of a ship, that hung a dreadful face, swaying slowly from side to side. It was flat and malignant, as large as a small beer barrel, of a faded fungoid color, but the neck which supported it was mottled with dull yellow and black. As it flew past the yacht, in the swirl of the waters, I saw 2 immense coils roll up out of some great hollow in the tree, and the villainous head rose suddenly to the height of 8 or 10 feet, looking with dull, skin-covered eyes at the yacht. An instant later, the tree had shot past us and was plunging with its horrible passenger toward the Atlantic. "What was it?" I cried. "It is our fiend of the cooperage," said Dr. Severall, and he had become in an instant the same bluff, self-confident man that he had been before. "Yes, that is the devil who has been haunting our island. It is the great python of the Gaboon." Now, the transformation of the Doctor is instantaneous, almost magical. The change is also one of genre, in which the narrative, which had shown the symptoms of an Imperial Gothic horror story, reveals itself to be a Blackwoods-type tale, Imperial tale after all. Severall, now bluff and self-confident again, is no longer the terrified participant of a story of supernatural horror. A stronger magic, that of European science, has restored him to himself. The apparently supernatural is tamed by the vocabulary of scientific natural history. As realism asserts itself, the python is real, the fiend was not. Here we're in the anthropological realm, where to name someone is to assert power over them. The naming of the fiend as the great python coincides exactly with the removal from the scene of the threat and terror it had embodied. Of course, what is also restored, as befits the kind of tale this has proved to be, is imperial racial authority and prestige. The story's last words are given to the Doctor. "The sooner we have breakfast and get back to the island, the better. Or some of those natives," doesn't use that word, "some of those natives might think we had been frightened. It is a frank, if dishonest, denial of the Gothic. Like others emerging from a horror show, Severall finds it important to pretend that he has never been frightened. Like imperial writers from Kipling to Orwell, he's aware that the white man's authority depends on an appearance or performance of natural mastery, even if that mastery is, ironically, another fiction. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Disturbing final image there, Douglas. Yikes. Great. We've had two papers that focus on the idea of, I suppose, the ludic of game playing, whether that be exercised on the sports field or on the page with genre. And some really nice continuities coming up there with the way in which game playing, I suppose, supports nationalism or empire. We've got some questions came in the chat, and I see that Robert Hampson has his hand up. So Robert, would you like to go ahead? If you're there, Robert. Can you hear us?
I'd muted myself, sorry.
Oh, there you go. Okay.
Right. Those are two really interesting and thought-provoking papers, but I had a very small question for Douglas in the spirit of game playing, and it's to do with the name of the character, which I heard as Meldrum, M-E-L-D-R-U-M.
Correct.
And I wondered whether that's a reference to the Blackwoods Reader, whom Conrad certainly knew, of Meldrum.
Oh, nice one, Robert. I hadn't thought of that, and it may be. This story didn't go to Blackwoods. Actually, Conan Doyle, as a young man, was desperate to be published by Blackwoods because he was an Edinburgh man. It was a high prestige journal. But I think that only one of his stories, which is the Physiologist's Wife, was published in Blackwoods. By this stage of his career, it was his agent was basically placing his stories.
Was Meldrum from Edinburgh as well? I've got a feeling Meldrum might also have been from Edinburgh.
It's a Scottish name, isn't it? I don't know the answer to that, Robert. Very likely, I would think. Christine might know.
I don't know.
Right. We think he probably was, but we can look him up.
Okay.
Great, thanks. Simon James, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks. Great papers, both of them. I really enjoyed them. I've got a question for Mark about like 3 words in one of the quotations from Lost World, where Lord John says of rugby, it's the last decent game we've got left. And I teach The Lost World alongside other texts, such as Gissing's The Whirlpool, for instance, too. And it's impossible to teach them without seeing World War I as a kind of catastrophe of imperial decline, whose shadow falls backwards through history across both texts. And I'm sorry, I'm obsessed with temporality, so that's what my question is about too. Whether Conan Doyle's representation of sport is always nostalgic like this. So I'm thinking also about Challenger's judgment of Malone as a kind of Irishman, that he's a good future-looking, dark-haired Irishman rather than a degenerate, primitive, red-haired kind of Irishman. I mean, you'll have read a lot more of Conan Doyle's sporting text than I have too, and I wonder if it is coloured with sort of imperial, with nostalgia, fear of decline, and so on.
Oh, I think there's a lot of that, especially when he says, yeah, it's their last great sport. Other sports have been, taken over by other countries, and by then they were off the podiums at the Olympics. And yeah, I think a lot of it is also Conan Doyle's love of amateur sports. When he writes about baseball after he had seen it in America, he loves the game. It's short. It doesn't take as long as a cricket match. It's 3 hours. You're done. You're out. But he does talk very negatively about the professionalism in baseball, and I think it's that creeping in and creeping into the Olympics too, of the athlete, not the all-round athlete, but the specialist that Conan Doyle really likes. And it is a nostalgic look at when everyone was in school and they practiced all sports. There were no specialists. And I think that's one of the things, and you know, when they're describing Lord John Roxton, you know, there's the fencing, the oars, the boxing gloves. He was a crack shot. So I think it was, yeah, it's nostalgia for Conan Doyle, who, as I said, his daughter wanted him to be remembered as an all-rounder and not the specialist that sport had become. And so, yeah, I'd say his view on sport is somewhat nostalgic, for sure.
I hadn't considered it in that light. How interesting. Thank you. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Well, look, we're bang on 4:45 now, and I think it might be best, just for the purposes of keeping to schedule, if we stop there, although I'm sure we could continue. If you do have more questions, please continue to use the chat. We'll take a bit of a longer break now because it is coming up for wine o'clock. So you can maybe, well, not in Canada. You guys have to stay on the tea. And we'll see you back here in 15 minutes for the performance. So thanks again, both Douglas and Mark. That was fantastic. Great.
Thank you, Christine.